Emotional maturity isn't about age, it's about growth. We've all met people who might look grown up on the outside but act like they're stuck in high school on the inside. Today, I want to break down the top 3 signs of emotional immaturity. And as you listen, ask yourself, do I see these signs in others or do I see them in me? Because recognizing them is the first step to change. 1. They avoid responsibility. When something goes wrong, an emotionally immature person will always point the finger. It's never their fault, it's their boss, their partner, their parents, the universe, Mercury in retrograde. But here's the truth: responsibility is ownership, and ownership is power. If you can't own your choices, you can't change your future. 2. They struggle to regulate their emotions. Think about someone who explodes over the smallest inconvenience or gives you the silent treatment for days. That's emotional immaturity. Mature people feel emotions, but they don't let emotions drive the car. They hit the brakes, think, and then respond. If your feelings control you, you're not leading your life, they are. 3. They shut down communication. An emotionally immature person doesn't know how to have tough conversations. Instead, they yell, they withdraw, or they shut down completely. But healthy communication is about leaning in, not running out. Growth doesn't happen in silence or screaming matches. It happens in honesty, vulnerability, and listening. When someone avoids responsibility, it shows up in the little things just as much as in the big things. You'll notice it in the way they explain why they're late, why they didn't follow through, or why a certain relationship fell apart. The story almost always revolves around someone else being the problem. It's the boss who never understands, the friend who betrayed them, the partner who was too demanding, or just bad luck striking again. Rarely do they pause to say, what could I have done differently? That's the hallmark of emotional immaturity, shifting the blame outward instead of looking inward. The danger in avoiding responsibility is that it locks a person into the same cycle of mistakes. When every setback is someone else's fault, there's no reason to change. And if there's no reason to change, there's no growth. It's easier to build excuses than it is to build self-awareness, but the cost of those excuses is high. Over time, people begin to notice, friends lose trust, coworkers lose patience, and relationships weaken because nobody wants to keep carrying the weight of someone who refuses to carry their own. Avoidance of responsibility also shows up in how emotionally immature people react to conflict. Instead of addressing the issue directly, they might dodge conversations, give half-truths, or even lie to cover up mistakes. The fear of being exposed as wrong or flawed pushes them into hiding. But here's the irony. In trying to protect themselves from blame, they actually create more of it. People respect honesty far more than perfection, and when someone can't admit fault, they lose credibility. This avoidance can sneak into everyday life in subtle ways. Think about someone who constantly procrastinates and then blames their schedule, their energy, or the world for not having enough hours in the day. Or the person who breaks a promise and says, I just forgot, as if that erases the disappointment left behind. Even in small choices, like forgetting to call back, missing deadlines, or leaving chores undone, the refusal to take responsibility creates cracks in trust that eventually add up. At its core, avoiding responsibility is about control. By pointing outward, emotionally immature people believe they're protecting their ego, but what they're really doing is giving away their power. Because if the problem is always someone else, the solution is always out of their hands. When someone struggles to regulate their emotions, it doesn't just show up in moments of anger. It shows up everywhere. It's the person who slams doors when they're frustrated, the one who shuts down completely when something doesn't go their way, or the friend who flips from laughter to hostility in a matter of seconds. Emotional immaturity makes feelings the driver instead of the passenger, and that means every situation becomes unpredictable. People around them often feel like they're walking on eggshells, never knowing when a simple comment will trigger an explosion or a withdrawal. The problem isn't that emotions exist. Everyone feels angry, sad, jealous, or frustrated at times. The real issue is the inability to process those feelings in a healthy way. Instead of pausing to reflect, the immature response is to react instantly. That reaction might be yelling, throwing insults, storming off, or using silence as a weapon. It could even show up as passive-aggressive behavior, like saying one thing while meaning another. In every case, the person is letting their emotions run unchecked, and it creates chaos in their relationships. Poor emotional regulation also leads to overreactions. A minor inconvenience becomes a catastrophe. A disagreement turns into a war. A bit of constructive feedback feels like a personal attack. This magnification of problems makes life harder not only for the person experiencing it, but for everyone around them. Instead of solving issues, the emotional outburst becomes the issue, and progress gets lost in the storm of feelings. It's easy to see how this kind of pattern damages trust. People stop being honest when they know the reaction will be extreme. Friends, coworkers, and partners begin to filter what they say, not because they don't care, but because they're tired of dealing with the fallout. That silence slowly chips away at connection because healthy relationships require open communication, and open communication can't survive in a climate of constant emotional volatility. Even more when emotions are unmanaged, The immature person ends up exhausting themselves. The constant roller coaster of highs and lows takes energy, leaving little room for reflection or growth. Instead of learning from mistakes, they replay the same scenarios again and again, driven by impulse rather than intention. What starts as a simple inability to manage feelings eventually turns into a cycle of instability, where every decision, every relationship, and every challenge is filtered through unchecked emotion. When communication breaks down, it rarely happens in one big moment. It shows up in all the small ways someone chooses silence, avoidance, or aggression instead of openness. An emotionally immature person often struggles to express what they feel in a healthy way, so rather than talk through a disagreement, they either shut down completely or lash out with words that cut deeper than they realize. For some, communication turns into a battle where the goal is not to understand, but to win. And in that battle, listening disappears. They interrupt, they raise their voice, they twist the narrative, and instead of finding a resolution, they create distance. For others, the breakdown looks quieter, but just as damaging: the cold shoulder, the silent treatment, the refusal to engage in any dialogue at all. The issue with this kind of communication is that it leaves problems unresolved. When someone refuses to speak or refuses to hear, the conflict doesn't vanish. It just lingers beneath the surface, waiting to resurface later in an even bigger form. Relationships begin to feel fragile because there's no foundation of trust in the words being shared. People on the receiving end of this kind of behavior often feel like they are guessing, constantly trying to interpret unspoken cues or hidden meanings instead of being met with direct honesty. That guessing game creates tension, confusion, and frustration, making it nearly impossible to build deeper connections. A breakdown in communication also reveals a lack of emotional courage. It's easier to avoid hard conversations than to sit in the discomfort of them, but avoidance comes at a price. Without communication, boundaries aren't respected, expectations aren't clear, and resentment grows quietly in the background. Over time, that resentment can destroy the very thing someone was trying to protect by avoiding the conversation in the first place. The emotionally immature person often doesn't realize how much their communication patterns affect others. They may believe that silence keeps the peace, when in reality it builds walls. They may believe that yelling shows strength, when in reality it shows a lack of control. They may believe that withdrawing protects them, when in reality it isolates them. Each choice to withhold, to shout, or to ignore becomes another brick in the wall, separating them from the people who are trying to connect with them. Instant gratification is one of the clearest signs of emotional immaturity because it reveals an inability to wait, to sacrifice, or to think beyond the present moment. It shows up in the choices people make every single day: spending money they don't have, eating what feels good in the moment without thinking about the consequences later, or abandoning commitments the second they become inconvenient. The pattern is always the same: the craving for relief, comfort, or pleasure outweighs the discipline to hold back. And while it might bring temporary satisfaction, it almost always leaves behind regret, disappointment, or missed opportunities. When someone constantly chases instant gratification, they live in a cycle of short-term highs followed by long-term lows. The quick fix feels good, but the aftermath doesn't. Impulsive purchases lead to debt. Impulsive words lead to broken trust. Impulsive actions lead to strained relationships. The inability to delay gratification means they keep trading tomorrow's peace for today's thrill, and eventually, that trade starts costing more than they realize. It's not just about money or time, it's about the trust others place in them, the reliability they fail to build, and the opportunities they miss because they couldn't resist the temptation of the moment. This lack of patience also affects how they handle goals. Emotional immaturity struggles with the idea of slow progress, with the discipline of building something brick by brick. If success doesn't come quickly, if results aren't visible right away, they're tempted to give up and move on. That's why so many projects, relationships, or personal goals get abandoned halfway through. The need for immediate payoff overpowers the willingness to endure discomfort, and as a result, they rarely get to experience the rewards that come with persistence. Instant gratification can also damage relationships in more subtle ways. A person who always seeks quick comfort may avoid hard conversations because they don't feel good in the moment, even though those conversations are necessary for growth. They may choose to distract themselves with entertainment or escape rather than face emotional pain directly. The short-term avoidance feels easier, but the long-term effect is unresolved conflict, distance, and lack of depth in their connections. By choosing what feels good now over what's healthy later, they remain stuck in patterns that prevent true growth, and the cycle keeps repeating itself. Every time discomfort arises, playing the victim is one of the most common behaviors that reveal emotional immaturity because it shifts all responsibility away from the person and places it on the world around them. It's the mindset that says, life is always unfair to me, or people are always against me. And while unfair situations do happen, the immature person uses this narrative as a shield against accountability. In their story, they are always the one who has been wronged, always the one who suffers, and never the one who contributes to the problem. This outlook gives them temporary comfort because it absolves them of responsibility, but it keeps them trapped in a cycle of blame and helplessness. When someone consistently plays the victim, they begin to see every challenge through the lens of injustice. A friend forgetting to call becomes proof that nobody cares. A boss setting expectations becomes evidence of unfair treatment. A disagreement in a relationship becomes one more example of how they are mistreated. This distorted perspective prevents them from seeing nuance, from understanding that life's difficulties are not always personal attacks, and from realizing that sometimes they are part of the reason things go wrong. Emotional growth requires the ability to step back and see one's own role, but the victim mindset blocks that process. The danger of this behavior is not just how it affects the individual, but how it wears down those around them. Friends and partners eventually grow tired of constant negativity. People who genuinely care feel drained when every conversation turns into a list of grievances and injustices. Over time, this creates distance because being around someone who always positions themselves as powerless makes others feel powerless too. Support turns into frustration, and relationships suffer because nobody wants to feel like they are endlessly responsible for rescuing someone who refuses to take responsibility for themselves. Playing the victim also becomes a way to avoid growth. As long as the world is to blame, there is no reason to change. Every mistake can be explained away by bad luck or other people's flaws, so self-reflection is never necessary. But this avoidance only deepens the sense of helplessness. The more they cling to the victim role, the more they convince themselves that they are stuck, and that belief shapes their reality. Instead of learning resilience, they rehearse powerlessness until it becomes the only role they know how to play. Struggling with boundaries is a clear marker of emotional immaturity because it shows up in how someone manages both their own limits and the limits of others. An emotionally immature person often has difficulty respecting personal space, time, or values, and just as often, they fail to create healthy boundaries for themselves. On one side, you might see them constantly intruding, asking questions that are too personal, expecting immediate responses to texts or calls, or assuming they are entitled to your time and energy whenever they want it. On the other side, you might notice them saying yes when they mean no, agreeing to things they don't want to do, and stretching themselves too thin because they fear rejection or conflict if they stand their ground. Both extremes create problems because boundaries are the foundation of trust and balance in any relationship. When boundaries are ignored, relationships quickly become unbalanced. The person who disregards limits may come across as controlling, needy, or even manipulative, leaving others feeling suffocated. The person who cannot set boundaries for themselves may end up resentful, exhausted, or quietly angry because they are giving more than they can handle. In both cases, the lack of boundaries erodes respect. Without clear lines, people don't know where they stand, and trust begins to fade as misunderstandings pile up. Emotional immaturity often fuels the struggle because boundaries require self-awareness and self-control. Respecting another person's limits means acknowledging that the world doesn't revolve around your needs or your timing. Setting your own boundaries requires the strength to handle disappointment, to say no even when it might upset someone, and to value your own well-being without guilt. Immature people often fall short in these areas. They may interpret boundaries as rejection, taking them personally instead of seeing them as healthy. They may also avoid setting boundaries because they want to be liked, and in doing so, they sacrifice their own comfort to maintain surface-level peace. This difficulty with boundaries also creates instability. Without them, relationships swing between closeness and conflict, connection and resentment. People on the receiving end may feel drained or disrespected. While the immature person continues to wonder why others pull away, boundaries are not walls. They are guideposts that keep relationships safe, respectful, and balanced. But when someone lacks the maturity to understand that, they end up damaging the very connections they want. To protect defensiveness is one of the clearest signs of emotional immaturity because it reveals how someone handles feedback, criticism, or even the smallest suggestion that they might be wrong. Instead of listening, reflecting, and considering another perspective, the immature response is to put up a shield. That shield can look like denial, excuses, counterattacks, or even turning the conversation back on the other person. What could have been an opportunity for growth turns into a battle for self-protection, where the only goal is to avoid feeling exposed. The moment they sense criticism, even if it's gentle or well-meaning, they hear it as an attack and their walls go up. This constant defensiveness makes communication difficult because it shuts down honesty. People around them quickly learn that offering feedback isn't worth the effort, since it only leads to conflict or tension. Instead of open dialogue, the relationship becomes one-sided, with everyone tiptoeing to avoid triggering the defensive reaction. Over time, this lack of honesty creates distance. Friends stop being fully transparent, partners hold back their true feelings, and coworkers stop offering input, not because they don't care, but because they are tired of hitting a wall every time they try to help. Defensiveness also reveals a deeper struggle with insecurity. At its core, The defensive person equates being wrong with being unworthy, so any correction feels like a personal attack on their value. Rather than seeing mistakes as normal parts of being human, they see them as threats to their self-image. That's why their reactions can feel exaggerated anger, sarcasm, or shutting down, because they are not fighting the feedback itself, but the fear of looking weak, flawed, or inadequate. What makes defensiveness especially damaging is how it keeps people stuck. Growth requires the humility to admit when we're wrong, the openness to hear hard truths, and the patience to learn from them. But when every piece of feedback is blocked, there's no room for change. The person ends up repeating the same mistakes, facing the same conflicts, and wondering why nothing ever improves. In reality, it's the shield they hold up that prevents progress, not the world around them. And as long as defensiveness is their first instinct, they will continue to miss the lessons that could have helped them become stronger, wiser, and more grounded. Fear of vulnerability is one of the most telling signs of emotional immaturity because it hides beneath so many other behaviors: sarcasm, detachment, anger, or even constant business. At its root, it's the unwillingness to show what's real, to admit fear, to confess uncertainty, or to express need. An emotionally immature person sees vulnerability as weakness, something to avoid at all costs, because to them it feels like opening the door for rejection, judgment, or pain. Instead of leaning into honesty, they cover themselves with masks, presenting only the polished, controlled version of who they want others to see. This fear creates distance in relationships, even when connection is what they actually crave. Without vulnerability, conversations stay surface level, focused on safe topics that never reveal what's truly going on inside. Arguments spiral because neither side is willing to admit hurt, insecurity, or fear of loss. Love feels incomplete because intimacy requires honesty. Honesty requires vulnerability. When someone refuses to show what they feel, others are left guessing, trying to read between the lines, and eventually growing frustrated at the wall that never comes down. Fear of vulnerability also fuels control. By keeping emotions hidden, the immature person believes they are protecting themselves from harm. They avoid saying, "I need help," or "I feel scared," because those words make them feel exposed. They may laugh things off that actually cut deep, or they may react with anger when what they really feel is sadness. In doing so, they trade authenticity for armor, but that armor becomes heavy to carry. It doesn't just block out pain, it blocks out joy, connection, and growth. The irony is that the very thing they fear is the only thing that builds strength. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's the courage to be seen as you are. But emotional immaturity resists that truth, clinging instead to the belief that strength is found in never letting anyone see you sweat, never admitting when you're struggling, never letting down your guard. This resistance often leaves them isolated, misunderstood, and disconnected, not because people don't care, but because people can only connect with what is shared. The fear of vulnerability keeps them safe in the short term, but it also keeps them lonely in the long term, locked away from the deeper bonds that only honesty can create. Emotional immaturity isn't about age. It isn't about how long you've lived. It's about how willing you are to grow. The signs: avoiding responsibility, struggling to manage emotions, shutting down communication, chasing instant gratification, playing the victim, crossing boundaries, getting defensive, and fearing vulnerability aren't just random flaws, they're signals. Signals pointing to where work is needed, where healing is required, and where growth can happen. Every single one of us shows these signs at some point. That doesn't make us broken. It makes us human. What matters is whether we recognize them when they show up and whether we choose to do something about them. Because maturity doesn't happen overnight. It happens choice by choice, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, when we decide not to react the same way we always have. The truth is, the people who grow are not the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who refuse to stay stuck in the same patterns. So the question isn't, do these signs show up in you? The real question is, what are you going to do when they do?